Welcome to the Novice to Office podcast. I am your host, Trey Bam. I hope everyone got to see the inauguration, or at least the highlight reel. I have attended 2 inaugurations in my lifetime. During the first one, I inadvertently led my family of 2 baby boys, their mother, and my parents into a crowd of, let's say, enthusiastic protesters in front of the Supreme Court. During the second inauguration, a surprise snowfall before the ball we were attending prevented the ride I had hired from getting up our street on a Virginia hillside. So we slid in our formal attire down the sidewalk. I still think everyone had a good time. I had a nasty cold during that one as well, and I thought the bourbon would help, but it didn't. Um, anyway, off we go into Trump number 47. Um, as I said last time, I really think, though, we'll have 4 more years of the same, at least in terms of the everyday lives of Americans. The one caveat being that immigration policy would change, and federal immigration policy is going to change or otherwise dominate the news, even if the law or rules don't explicitly change. Precisely because President Trump's terms are non consecutive. We've gone from 45 to 47. Here's what I mean. If you'll recall, any kind of movement on immigration reform got stymied during Trump's first term. He was able to get the wall going, but not without a lot of effort and controversy. Um, but he hit his own wall during a more serious effort at actual policy reform when it came to helping the so-called Dreamer Americans, or those immigrants who entered the country as children and remained, uh, built their lives. Um, this was due to a blow-up he had with Senator Dick Durbin during an Oval Office meeting. Senator Durbin was a senior Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, which oversees immigration policy. He was also part of the Senate leadership. And Senator Lindsey Graham, also on the committee, had brokered a meeting between Durbin, an Illinois Democrat, and Trump because Senator Graham, had discerned that the two could possibly make a deal for the Dreamers. Um, but the meeting imploded when, during a discussion of the visa lottery program, which I'll explain here in a little bit, the president allegedly referred to certain nations as shithole countries. Between this and the determination not to give the president a legislative win, um, immigration policy got stuck. Um, During then the hiatus of the 2 Trump terms, during the Biden administration, um, the change that he made to COVID restrictions, along with a global perception that a Democrat in the White House would accommodate them, a massive flood of people towards the country's borders occurred. The Department of Homeland Security, specifically the Customs and Border Protection Agency, or CPB, and that's the old Border Patrol. Um, CPB classifies any sort of interaction with an inadmissible non-citizen as an encounter. That's a term of art. And this applies for someone who just waited across the Rio Grande, someone at an Arizona truck stop where visas might be checked, or at JFK Airport when someone tries to enter using improper paperwork. Um, Encounters can be of the same person, and most estimates put that at about 25% of the total encounters. So there's recidivism. In 2021, these encounters tripled from the previous year, from 500,000 to 1.5 million. As of last year, that 1.5 million doubled again. So we've had 3 million encounters each of the last 2 years. This has all happened during the Biden administration, and these encounters have never been this high in the history of our country. During the late 1990s, during the second term of Bill Clinton, The encounters peaked in the 1.5 to 1.6 million range. That was mainly due to NAFTA. W. Bush's second term saw several 1.2 million years, but rarely in general do the encounters get above a million. During the Obama administration and Trump's first term, the number was actually a bit below this. President Obama was called the deporter in chief, but it has never been 3 million a year, as has been the case recently. And the Biden administration has released almost 85% of those people from the encounters into the country pending a court date. As you'll recall, the Trump administration managed that by requiring the alien to wait in Mexico for their court appearance. Um, and remember, these are the actual reported encounters. These do not include what CPB calls gotaways. Okay, and those are people who they saw through another means uh, get away from an encounter. And that's a guess, but the official DHS estimate is that 1.6 million immigrants have gotten away over the past 3 years. And that, in many ways, is the number one problem with illegal immigration. By definition, we don't know who and how many people are here illegally. We only have estimates plugged into a statistical formula used by the Census Bureau. All told, most estimates put all the released people, the gotaways, and the visa overstay aliens in the U.S. at between 12 and 15 million people, or about 4% of the U.S. population. So why is this really a problem? Well, I kind of touched on one issue, that is, it's hard to know if either an individual or group of individuals who came here have the U.S.'s best interests at heart. It is true that the vast majority of folks come here to work and make their lives better. But even if that's 99.5% of 3 million people, 0.5% is 30,000 people. The 9/11 attacks were committed by 19 people, and 15 of those people technically had a valid visa. So there is a legitimate security concern. Uh, Beyond these 3 million encounters that occurred during the Biden break, as it were, um, uh, Trump's policies, his stymied policies, kind of the slow movement on immigration policy that had been the case, have been transformed into a wild-eyed call by the American people for massive mass deportation right here and right now. Now, if we set aside the security issues, what has exactly generated this national outcry? Well, an answer to this question is always controversial. One side wants to accuse the other of being inherently bigoted and xenophobic, and then the other hurls an accusation that the other side is enabling crime and criminals. Uh, I don't think it's actually either of those, and nor do I think that it's job envy. The situation with tech jobs notwithstanding. Um, y- Most Americans, for good or bad, appreciate it that, you know, the sorry jobs in America are getting done, hanging drywall and whatever. Um, but I don't think it's any of those reasons that get people going. Um, to explain my view, we'll have to do a little history. The U.S. used to have a wide open immigration system. The generation of the founders spoke constantly of making it easy for immigrants to come here and be a part of our experiment. Now, it is true that immigrants to them, or at least the best immigrants, were whites who spoke a Germanic language and did not follow the Pope. That is true. It is also true, shamefully, that some of the founders uh, believed certain immigrants could be forcibly brought here, and particularly those with black skin. But even that was being questioned after the revolution and restricted by the very slaveholders who were involved in formulating policy. Still, the gate was flung open. Really, there was no gate. Um, it was not until 1882 that the first attempt to restrict anything was put into law, and this was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was deeply racist on its face. It wanted to send back all the Chinese males who were brought in to build the railroads from the Pacific coast back to China once those railroads were done. Um, Still, though, for all its bigotry, I think the law hinted at what Americans truly want when it comes to restricting immigration, which, again, I'll elaborate on. The next big attempt at restricting immigration was during World War I, when productivity demands were high and people were afraid that certain immigrants weren't as productive. So the Immigration Act of 1917 required a literacy test for citizenship. And actually, you only had to demonstrate literacy in any language. Now, Republicans under President Warren G. Harding amended the law further in 1921 by instituting quotas. Now, quotas were for each country based on the number of immigrants from that country already living in the U.S. The federal government calculated a given nation's quota based on the 1910 census of 3% of that original nation's population in the U.S. And this is where Americans got the first idea of controlled immigration and population growth. In 1924, and this was a bigger amendment, the policy really got restrictive when the Johnson-Reed Act, Senator Johnson, Senator Reed, amended those quotas down from 3% to 2%, and that just reduced the number of people from a given country. But it calculated that based on the census of 1890. So it moved from 1910 back to 1890. And the 1890 census was the one before the great migrations of Eastern Europeans, Italians, and Jews came in at the turn of the century. As a result, the quotas for the UK, for Americans from the UK, Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia got boosted for those types of immigrants. Besides America's persistent nativism, the popular push for this was because of an anti-Semitic fear of communism in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, in addition to an ethnocentrism. In the 1920s, the KKK was anti-Semitic as well as anti-civil rights, and they marched in public. American labor unions as well, which by this time were dominated by Irish descendants, wanted to protect their jobs. So this unholy alliance has served to push elected officials at the time to invert the ideas of the country from the founders down through the Statue of Liberty. And remember, this is only less than 4 years after the Statue of Liberty was put up. All of this very ethnocentric, disgustingly so, truthfully. And this is what was in place through the 1950s. In the 1950s, we saw the first waves of immigration from Mexico. And that 3% system I told you about worked as long as immigrants had to use a boat or a plane to get here. Well, remember that encounter word I used? The first time the U.S. had more than 1 million encounters was in the mid-50s. And that number by far came from Mexico. And because they're simply a neighbor. All you have to do is walk to get here. Congress then began to feel pressure for all those nativist reasons, and the rhetoric shifted more to job protection. But the craftiest senator ever to serve happened to be from Texas with a constituency directly tied to its Mexican heritage, and that senator soon became vice president, then president. So then, in part, to address the migration from Mexico during the 50s and 60s, but also to capitalize on it, President Lyndon Johnson passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 with Congress because he knew how to get stuff through Congress. And this is the law that most governs the system today. In the 1965 law, the old quota system with its preference for WASPs was tossed out in favor of large hemispheric allotments, which then are divvied up amongst the given nations in that hemisphere proportionately. Back in 65, the hemispheric allotments were in the 100,000s. But today, that allotment for both is 675,000. These are just individuals wanting to come here, just independent immigration. And that number's been the same for about 35 years. Um, this is also called the cap in immigration slang, so you may hear that referred to in the weeks to come. The cap is 675,000 people annually. Uh, More importantly, the 1965 law immigrated the new preference system for immigrants. In the preference system, you can obtain a visa if you are a family member of a U.S. citizen, or if you are a highly skilled worker or an artist, or among other things. You can also get one if the labor secretary certifies we need workers in agriculture and other industries. Um, but most of the preferences have to do with family reunification. Um, because of this preference system for family members, and it can be for minor kids, adult kids, grandparents, etc., uh, a U.S. citizen can sponsor a family member. They can come here and then they can apply for legal permanent resident status, or LPR. LPRs are what you call them. This is the green card that you hear about. There's no limit on how many people can apply for an LPR uh, annually. With a green card, you can get a social security number, work, and receive public benefits in America, even if you've never paid into the system. Uh, Not only that, as soon after taking office, the Biden administration set it up to where you can apply for a social security number at the same time you apply for your green card. 1 million green cards, LPRs, are issued annually, and there's no limit. So clearly, this is the better way to come into the country legally. Um, an LPR is not an illegal immigrant. They are here. It is true, however, that many people who have overstayed their visa are those who are waiting on or who are trying to apply for LPR status but don't have it. Um, uh, this estimate is around 45%. And so these are people who came here under the family program. Their visa to get here has expired. They haven't applied for LPR status yet. Or they can be students. Students will often overstay their visa. Most of these people who are here overstaying their visa are from a place that requires a boat or a plane: China, the Philippines, India. Um, but whereas those who are in kind of this broader unknown category, they're from a walkable distance, let's say, from Mexico all the way down to Venezuela. And Mexico, by the way, has been and still is the main nation of origin for illegal immigrants, and it ranges from a third, sometimes up to half. Um, the math headache that is the federal government's visa lottery system uh, works like this, in a nutshell. If not enough people from a given country want to take us up on an immigrant visa, the unused allotments for that country get pooled and reassigned to a country that needs more. And this is all sliced up under that cap I told you about. If you're from a country that has a high demand for slots and you don't have a relative who is a U.S. citizen, then you need one of these lottery slots. Um, and that takes a long time, sometimes up to 10 years. Um, as you can see, the U.S. Immigration system is very complicated and restrictive, which is why there is such a flood to get around it. In the age of the internet and social media, quirks about the U.S. system can be communicated rapidly, including internationally. And the looser category that a lot of people have seized onto is coming here and applying for asylum. Now, asylum used to be reserved for those who are like from Vietnam or Cuba. Afghanistan is a recent example. Those who are American allies or those fleeing from communism back in the day. But people here are applying for asylum because they say they are fleeing an oppressive regime or are facing economic hardship caused by an oppressive regime, like Venezuela or Haiti. Um, And so they'll apply, and we can review that, but that takes time. Different administrations have either released them into the U.S., waiting for that review and that court date, or they required them to wait in Mexico, which I'm pretty sure we're going to return to. Um, so, it, you know, a court reviews it. And when we say court, these are administrative law courts. These aren't state or local courts. Sometimes federal courts are involved, but what we mean is a special administrative court run by the Department of Homeland Security. Um, we might be able to understand why there is this hysterical shriek to deport those here illegally, if only because they're not following these crazy and cumbersome rules. But I don't believe simply skipping the line is what has everyone so upset. Elected officials often say things like, well, we're a nation of laws and everyone needs to follow them. But they're only saying that because if they say anything else, they'll sound bigoted. Still, though, I don't believe that not following the rules is what gets people going. Neither do I believe that Americans are so upset about illegal immigration because they are in fact bigoted. This was definitely the case 100 years ago and longer, shamefully to our history, but that's not what's going on. It is true that many Americans still struggle with prejudicial fear, but no one believes that or the majority don't believe that this or that ethnicity or race are inherently superior. I believe people are fired up because immigration is just simply messy and disorderly. Anytime you move, it's messy. The house you leave is messy. It's hard to get loaded up in the van, and your house is disorganized for weeks, even after you've unloaded the truck. Yes, Americans can be as ethnocentric as they are generous. And Americans hate it that people get handouts just for crossing over. But then they'll turn around and haggle with the salesperson to get a discount on a golf putter. That's mercurial, though. Deep down, Americans value being organized. And I would say organization is as much a part of our DNA as our guns. Today, news images bring us long lines of human beings, lost children mixed in, tired and exhausted from a 2,000-mile walk. We can drive down certain streets in our town and see unpermitted street vendors crowding the sidewalk, litter everywhere. Our schools are packed with children who arrive at events with extended families, or who their families don't quite understand what's going on with different policies. All of this offends Americans' sense of order. It's a sense of order that can be traced to the New Englanders' Wesleyan belief that cleanliness is next to godliness, as well as the Virginia Surveyors' Washingtonian belief that no one has a right to squat on unmarked land. Americans see these children trying to wade the Rio Grande, or families camped on top of each other, and even if they want a stronger border or to crack down on people not following the rules, they simultaneously support easier rules or a pathway to citizenship because they know that all this disorder isn't good for anyone. So, what are the Trump administration's changes to policy and or crackdown on illegal immigrants going to look like over the next few weeks? Well, there's going to be a lot of drama. We're going to see a lot of X footage and cell phone captures that look like a myopic episode of Cops or Live PD. Right now and in the coming weeks, we will see a war on disorganization enacted by the Trump administration. Of those 12 million or so illegal immigrants, uh, somewhere between 1 and 2 million of them have active deportation orders, meaning we know who they are and that they have violated the terms of their visa or committed a crime that makes them inadmissible, even as an LPR. Uh, Even many Democrats, tail between their legs from last November, have expressed their support for rounding these folks up. But it is a massive undertaking. even if we can physically track them down. 1.5 million people, let's say. The entire Border Patrol, tactical units, and field agents is only 24,000 personnel. That means each Border Patrol agent has to leave their post, not call in sick, and go find 62.5 people each and hope they'll come along quietly. Now, of course, they'll try to do concentrations and raids. Everyone has to be booked. Everyone has to be put on a plane. This is why President Trump suggested using the Army, um, local law enforcement, especially if they're a sanctuary city, is under pressure to assist with the job. Uh, Back in 1986, President Reagan granted an amnesty to many illegal immigrants. Back then, just as a rabbit trail, the thinking was that as long as the U.S. absorbs Mexico's restless citizens, then that country will be less inclined to embrace communism. But along with the amnesty of the 86 law, President Reagan also granted the federal government the ability to detain or have a designed encounter with those arrested for hard crime by local law enforcement. Bill Clinton expanded this provision, and George W. Bush allowed information sharing. Um, what will happen today is an individual will be arrested for domestic violence, let's say. Then that city police department or that sheriff would send the feds their fingerprints for an ID check if they feel that they're not here legally. Well, many large cities and counties, some backed up by their state houses, don't do that if they're trying to be a sanctuary city. So while the Trump administration deals with that, you will see other smaller jurisdictions, however, get aggressive on it. In some cases, jurisdictions can also serve immigration warrants if they are deputized by the Department of Homeland Security. Um, Given the cost that a lot of these smaller jurisdictions have with incarceration and everything, I'm pretty sure they're going to cooperate if it means they can put it off on the feds. And the president can crank up these operations right away, as he is doing. But he does need additional funding from Congress ultimately. Uh, on the legislative front, speaking of, some people have called for axing the family preference system. Some have called for blocking immigration from certain countries. Still, though, there is talk of doing something for the Dreamers, basically giving them some sort of amnesty. What is absent from the conversation is what kind of immigration system do we want? I mean, that has been skipped over. And while opinion polls now say that the preference for deportation is as high as 60%, many of those same people who say that do support a better, easier, more organized system. So again, I don't think bigotry really has as much to do with it anymore. I think it has to do with the issue is disorganization. Um, but if we can address the more basic questions about what we want, I really think that's where the policy needs to start. Um, anyway, I don't want to pontificate, but uh, thank you for listening. Um, Next time, we're going to talk about something a lot less controversial, and that is federal spending. I promise it won't be a lullaby. Um, anyway, don't forget to subscribe and like. And until we meet again, keep it free.